It was an ordinary day in a small Southern American town. The local grocery store, owned by Mr. James, was well known for its welcoming atmosphere and quality service. The store had become the heart of the neighborhood, especially for the black community, who valued the respect and fairness the owner upheld. Mr. James, a man of gentle manners but strong resolve, managed the business with his family. However, not everyone knew that his 16-year-old son Marcus occasionally helped out at the store, preferring to stay out of the spotlight. Marcus, a black teenager with a friendly smile and a thoughtful demeanor, stopped by the store after school to buy a watermelon for a family dinner. He was dressed in his simple school uniform, a white shirt, dark trousers, and a worn-out backpack he had carried for years. That day, he looked like any ordinary teenager, blending in with the other customers. Behind the counter stood Jake, a new employee. Jake was a white man with a sharp gaze and a haughty demeanor. Recently hired, he had moved to town not long ago. He didn't seem to care much about fitting into the local community, and from his first days on the job, his attitude had been curt and dismissive, even though he tried to mask it behind a polite smile. As Marcus approached the counter with the watermelon, Jake gave him a long, skeptical look. To Jake, Marcus was just another kid he didn't trust. "Are you sure you can afford that?" Jake asked with a smirk, crossing his arms. Marcus froze. He was all too familiar with that tone. It wasn't the first time he had faced suspicious looks or questions when shopping. Taking a deep breath, he kept his composure. "Yes, of course, that's why I'm here," Marcus replied firmly but without hostility, trying to avoid escalating the situation. Jake, however, wasn't about to stop. He continued to scrutinize the teenager, clearly intent on provoking him. Instead of ringing up the watermelon, Jake delayed, making a show of ignoring Marcus's presence. "You know, you have to watch out for kids like this," Jake said loudly, as if speaking to no one in particular but ensuring that other customers could hear. Marcus felt the heat of embarrassment rise in his face as other shoppers began to turn their heads. Some looked curious, others sympathetic, but Marcus stood his ground. He knew he had the money, and there was no reason he should be treated this way. "I just want to buy this watermelon," Marcus repeated, his voice steady but tinged with frustration. Jake seemed to interpret Marcus's calm defiance as a challenge. A strange light flickered in Jake's eyes, as if he had decided to assert his dominance. To him, this was no longer about ringing up a simple purchase, it was about sending a message. The tension in the store was palpable. Customers whispered among themselves, one or two pulling out their phones to discreetly record what was unfolding. Marcus, despite his young age, understood the stakes. He couldn't simply walk away. That would feel like giving in to an unjust situation. But he also knew that pushing back too hard might make things worse. Jake slowly picked up the watermelon, holding it in his hands with exaggerated care. A smug smile spread across his face as he examined it. "Well, all right then," Jake said finally, his voice dripping with sarcasm. But in that moment, there was something unsettling in the way Jake was handling the watermelon. It wasn't the careful touch of someone about to hand it over. It felt more like the build-up to something much worse. The atmosphere in the store grew noticeably heavier. Customers in line began whispering among themselves, casting cautious glances at Jake. His face displayed a cold self-confidence, and it seemed like he was intentionally dragging things out. Marcus stood across from him, holding his gaze, though he felt increasingly uncomfortable. Tension simmered within him, but he maintained his composure with dignity. Jake, holding the watermelon in his hands, deliberately examined it slowly, as if inspecting it for flaws. But everyone could tell this wasn't about the quality of the fruit. His actions resembled more of a game aimed at testing the teenager's patience. "Are you sure you can carry this home?" he asked with a smirk, looking directly at Marcus. The question sounded casual, but the mocking tone was unmistakable. Some of the nearby customers began exchanging glances, realizing what was happening. On some faces, there was sympathy. On others, hesitation to intervene, fearing they might disrupt the fragile balance of the situation. "I already said I'm paying for the watermelon," Marcus replied, his irritation evident. His voice was firm but calm. He understood that losing his temper would only make things worse. But Jake seemed to interpret every word from Marcus as a challenge. He chuckled, stepping back with the watermelon in both hands as if preparing to inspect it again. His movements were slow, almost theatrical. "You know, with people like you, one has to be cautious," he said loudly, making sure everyone in the store could hear. The remark sent a wave of tension through the room. A woman standing in line with her child turned to look at the cashier, her face registering surprise. Her lips parted as if she wanted to say something, but she held back. The faces of other customers reflected awkward silence. Marcus felt a surge of indignation rising in his chest, but he took a deep breath, trying to keep his cool. His mother had always told him, "Strength isn't about shouting louder, it's about staying calm." But at that moment, following that advice was proving difficult. "Just ring up the watermelon, please," he said, holding out his money. Jake leaned in slightly toward the teenager, his eyes glinting with something unsettling. A mocking grin spread across his face. "Oh, you want your watermelon? Of course you'll get it," he said, pretending to agree. But in the next instant, he did something no one expected. Jake suddenly lifted the watermelon high above Marcus's head. His face lit up with a wide grin filled with contempt and a hidden challenge. "Catch this!" he shouted, and slammed the heavy fruit down onto Marcus's head with force. A loud crack echoed through the store. The watermelon shattered into pieces and sticky juice spilled onto the floor, forming red streaks that seemed to symbolize something far more profound than a ruined fruit. Marcus staggered and dropped to his knees, stunned by the blow. He reached up to touch his head, unable to process what had just happened. The customers froze in shock. A woman in line gasped, grabbing her child's hand and stepping back. A man standing closer to the register covered his face with his hand, unable to believe what he had just witnessed. "Well, there you go, kid. Got your watermelon, didn't you?" Jake sneered, lowering his arms. He made no move to help Marcus get up. Marcus sat on the floor, his head lowered. Around him were scattered pieces of the watermelon, and the sticky rind left green streaks on the ground. But he didn't cry or yell. Slowly, he lifted his gaze and looked at Jake with an expression so piercing that for a moment, Jake's smug confidence faltered. At that moment, footsteps echoed from the back of the store. The noise and murmurs of outraged customers had drawn the attention of Mr. James. He opened the office door and froze at the sight before him. His son sitting on the floor, and the cashier standing nearby with a self-satisfied smirk. James's eyes darted from Jake to Marcus and finally to the sticky red streaks of juice spreading across the floor. "What is going on here?" His voice thundered through the store, silencing everyone in an instant. The entire store fell silent as Mr. James's voice cut through the air. Customers froze, turning toward the office door. His tall, commanding figure stepped into view, his face a mask of calm control. But his eyes, sharp and unyielding, showed that he was already piecing together the scene before him. His gaze swept the room. On the floor, surrounded by scattered chunks of watermelon, sat his son, Marcus. Sticky juice dripped from Marcus's hair, staining his shirt and pooling on the ground around him. Just a few steps away stood Jake, leaning casually against the counter, his posture oozing arrogance. Yet there was something in Jake's eyes, an edge of uncertainty, a crack in his facade. Mr. James strode across the store with deliberate calm, each step echoing loudly in the tense silence. He knelt down beside Marcus, placing a steady hand on his son's shoulder. Marcus looked up, his expression a mix of humiliation and anger. Their eyes met for a moment, and Mr. James gave a slight nod, silently telling his son, "I'm here now, you're not alone." Rising to his full height, Mr. James turned to Jake, his voice low and controlled. "Who did this?" he asked, though the answer was already clear. Marcus didn't need to say anything. He simply tilted his head toward Jake, whose smirk was fading rapidly. A man in the crowd, one of the customers who had been quietly watching, stepped forward. "It was him," the man said firmly, pointing at Jake. "He smashed the watermelon on the boy's head." Jake scoffed, trying to wave it off as if it were nothing. "You're all blowing this out of proportion," he said, spreading his hands with mock innocence. "It was just a joke, an accident, no big deal." Mr. James's gaze locked onto Jake's, cold and unwavering. "An accident?" he repeated softly, his voice carrying an unmistakable edge. "You're telling me this was an accident?" Jake faltered under the intensity of Mr. James's stare, but he quickly attempted to recover, straightening up and trying to look defiant. "Well, you know how they can be." Jake muttered, his voice dropping slightly but still audible enough for those nearby to hear. Causing problems, stirring things up. I was just trying to keep the peace. A gasp rippled through the crowd. A woman with her young son took a step back, her expression one of disbelief and disgust. Customers exchanged glances, their outrage bubbling to the surface. Mr. James's calm demeanor didn't waver, but something shifted in his stance, a tightening of his jaw, a subtle straightening of his back. He took one step closer to Jake, closing the distance between them. "Let me make something very clear," Mr. James said, his voice steady but brimming with restrained power. "That boy is my son, and in this store, no one is treated like that." Jake's face turned pale. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. He glanced around the room, realizing that no one was on his side. The murmurs of disapproval from the crowd grew louder, and a few customers had their phones out, capturing the unfolding confrontation. "Leave," Mr. James said, his tone final and unyielding. "Now." Jake hesitated, glancing around the room as if searching for an ally, but the disapproving stares from the customers told him he had no choice. Muttering under his breath, he grabbed his jacket and stormed out of the store, shoving the door open with unnecessary force. The tension in the room began to lift as the door swung shut behind him. Mr. James turned to the gathered crowd, his face softening but his voice still carrying authority. "I apologize for what you all witnessed here today," he said, addressing the customers. "This store is a place where everyone deserves respect, and I won't tolerate anything less." His words were met with nods and murmurs of agreement. An older woman stepped forward, placing a hand on his arm. "You did the right thing," she said kindly. "That kind of behavior has no place here." Mr. James gave her a small, grateful smile before turning back to Marcus, who was still standing quietly nearby. Placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder, he leaned in and said softly, "You okay, son?" Marcus nodded, the tension in his shoulders beginning to ease. He felt a sense of pride in his father, not just for standing up for him, but for doing it with such unwavering dignity. After Jake stormed out, the store began to settle back into its usual rhythm, but the tension still lingered in the air. Customers went about their business, but their occasional glances toward Mr. James and Marcus showed that the events of the day were far from forgotten. Marcus, still shaken, stood next to his father, his clothes sticky and stained from the watermelon. Around them, the broken pieces of fruit and the red juice on the floor were a vivid reminder of what had just transpired. Mr. James placed a firm but comforting hand on his son's shoulder and looked him in the eyes. "It's over now," he said gently. "You stood tall, and that's what matters." Marcus nodded, his expression a mix of gratitude and lingering frustration. His father's presence gave him strength, and he was slowly regaining his composure. Mr. James turned toward the employees and customers, his voice calm but carrying the weight of authority. "We are more than just a place that sells groceries," he said, addressing the room. "This store is part of this community, a place where everyone deserves to feel safe and respected. If someone can't uphold that, they have no business being here." His words were met with murmurs of agreement. A few customers nodded, and a soft round of applause broke out from a group near the back of the store. An older woman, who had been watching the entire event unfold, stepped forward with a kind expression. "You did the right thing, Mr. James," she said. "No one should have to go through that, especially not in your store." "Thank you," Mr. James replied, his voice sincere. Then turning back to Marcus, he added, "Let's clean you up, son." He led Marcus to the small office in the back of the store. Inside, he dampened a cloth and began gently wiping the sticky juice from Marcus's face and hands. His movements were careful, his expression softening as he worked. "You shouldn't have had to go through this," Mr. James said quietly. "Nobody should." Marcus didn't say anything, but his gaze spoke volumes. Gratitude for his father's unwavering support and pride in how he had handled the situation. When they returned to the store, the broken watermelon had been cleaned up and the store was bustling again. Several customers greeted Marcus with warm smiles or encouraging nods, offering silent support. A woman who had witnessed everything approached and said, "You're a brave young man, Marcus. Don't let anyone make you feel otherwise." Marcus managed a small smile, still feeling the sting of what had happened, but beginning to process the strength he had shown. Mr. James thanked the woman and returned to his work, ensuring the store returned to its usual welcoming atmosphere. Before closing, Mr. James took a moment to write a note and leave it at the register for the staff. Respect for everyone is the foundation of this store. If you can't uphold it, you don't belong here. That evening, Marcus walked home with his father, carrying a fresh, intact watermelon. At the family dinner, despite the challenges of the day, there was warmth and laughter. For Marcus, the events of that day were a reminder of the strength of his family and the importance of standing up for what's right. For Mr. James, it was a reaffirmation of his commitment to his values and his community. Together, they knew they had turned a moment of injustice into an example of resilience and dignity.